It was not a machine gun. It was not a mortar. It was something far older, something almost medieval in its brutal efficiency. A Winchester Model 12 trench gun. A pump-action shotgun, its short barrel wrapped in a heat shield, capable of delivering a wall of buckshot with each blast. And in the hands of an American Marine, it could fire as fast as he could work the pump. But what truly terrified Japanese infantry on islands like Guadalcanal, Pililliu, and Okinawa was the weapon's hidden trick. A mechanism so devastating that most soldiers who faced it never lived long enough to describe it. Slam fire. By holding the trigger and simply working the pump, the Winchester M12 could unleash a storm of shells in a heartbeat, turning close-range ambushes into massacres. For Japanese infantry, trained in the way of the bayonet charge, in the honor of the sword, and in the shock of close combat, nothing could prepare them for this kind of mechanical hurricane. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a psychological earthquake. And yet, this story is not only about the steel and wood of the shotgun, it's about the men who carried it, the men who feared it, and the brutal face-to-face combat in which it became infamous. On the blood-soaked battlefields of the Pacific, where the line between hunter and hunted could vanish in the blink of an eye, the Winchester Model 12 trench gun became a symbol of survival and of terror. Tonight, we walk through those jungles and beaches once more. We will hear the voices of the Marines who shouldered the shotgun and glimpse the fear it struck into Japanese defenders who never expected such a weapon to appear in their war. This is not just a tale of firepower. It is a tale of courage, desperation, and the savage intimacy of close combat in the Second World War. Because when American infantry brought the trench gun into the Pacific, the war changed forever. But how did a weapon born in the muddy trenches of World War I find new life in the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal? And what did it mean for the soldiers on both sides who fought and died under its thunder? To answer that, we must go back to the beginning. The trench gun was not born in the Pacific. Its story begins decades earlier, in the blood and mud of the First World War. In 1917, when America entered the Great War, its soldiers faced an old nightmare in a modern form: trench warfare. Close-quarters combat, room-to-room fighting in captured dugouts, and raids across no man's land demanded something different from the bolt-action rifles of the day. The U.S. Army turned to the Winchester Model 1897 and Model 1912 pump-action shotguns. Modified with bayonet lugs, heat shields, and shortened barrels, they became infamous. To the Germans, they were trench brooms, a weapon so brutal at clearing bunkers that Germany lodged an official diplomatic protest, calling their use inhumane. But the protest fell silent, because war is never humane, and the trench guns stayed. By the 1920s and 30s, the Winchester Model 12, sleeker, sturdier, capable of slam fire, was the perfected tool. Lawmen carried it, hunters loved it, and the military quietly kept it on the books. When America was thrust into a new war after Pearl Harbor, the trench gun returned. Only this time, the battlefields weren't cold trenches in Europe. They were dense jungles, coral ridges, and villages fortified by fanatical defenders. For the U.S. Marines and Army infantry fighting the Japanese Empire, the shotgun was more than a weapon. It was survival. Japanese infantry were masters of close-range tactics, ambushes, night infiltrations, sudden banzai charges. They were trained to close the distance, to break past rifles and machine guns with bayonet and blade. And in the choking green jungles of the Solomon Islands, visibility was often only a few yards. That was where the shotgun thrived. Unlike the M1 Garand, which carried 8 rounds of rifle ammunition, the Winchester M12 held 6 shells of .00 buckshot, 9 lead pellets each. At close range, one pull of the trigger was like unleashing a swarm of bullets. And when slam fired, the sound was deafening, like a drumbeat of thunder. The Japanese infantry, who charged with cries of banzai, often expected to face bayonets in return. Instead, they were met with walls of buckshot that cut down entire waves before they reached American lines. It wasn't just a tactical edge, it was a psychological one. The reputation of the shotgun spread quickly among Japanese defenders. Rumors whispered that it was unstoppable, but a single Marine with a trench gun could hold off a platoon. Some accounts suggest captured Japanese soldiers spoke of their fear of the weapon. To them it was sudden death, impossible to parry with sword, impossible to evade in close quarters. The Pacific Theater was a place where modern firepower met ancient warrior spirit, and in that collision, the trench gun became an unlikely symbol of American grit. But behind every weapon was a man, a Marine or soldier who had to carry it, clean it, and trust it with his life. And their stories reveal not just the power of the shotgun, but the terrible cost of using it. Because while the trench gun was feared by the enemy, it was also a burden for the men who pulled the trigger. And soon, as the war deepened, those men would face moments where even the slam-fire shotgun seemed powerless against the fury of the Japanese advance. History often remembers weapons by their technical specifications, but the truth of war is carried not in steel, but in flesh. The Winchester Model 12 trench gun was never just a weapon, it was a lifeline, and in the jungles of the Pacific, lifelines were precious. Take Private First Class Samuel "Sammy" Ortega, a farm boy from Texas. In a letter home from Guadalcanal in 1942, he wrote, "Mama, I carry a shotgun like the ones we used on the farm, but this one is shorter and heavier. I never thought I'd be using it on men. When they come at night screaming, you can't think, you just fire, and fire again. It is over so fast, I can hardly remember it, but in the morning, I can't forget." For men like Ortega, the trench gun was familiar, an echo of hunting trips and long days in rural America. But that familiarity clashed with the reality of war. Instead of quail or deer, they faced human beings charging in the dark. Then there was Corporal James "Red" Collins, a red-haired Marine from Chicago. In a post-war interview, he admitted, "I liked the shotgun. I trusted it. When a Jap came too close, it was the one thing that gave me peace of mind. But I still be honest, sometimes after a fight, looking at the ground, I wished I had carried something else." Weapons could keep you alive, but they could also haunt you. And what of the men who faced the shotgun? Private Kenji Sato of the Japanese 2nd Division kept a diary before his death on Guadalcanal. In it he described American firepower with awe and dread. "They do not fight with honor, they fight with thunder. At night their guns roar, and men fall like grass. I charged with my brothers, but the sound was like the sky splitting apart. No sword can stop it." For Sato and thousands of others, the Banzai charge was not madness. It was doctrine, duty, and often the only option left. Yet when doctrine met the slam fire of the Winchester, it shattered like glass. Between these two worlds, the farm boys of America and the warrior sons of Japan stood the shotgun, a weapon that turned moments of combat into personal reckonings. Because war is not only fought between armies, but within the hearts of the men who must survive it. And soon, those hearts would be tested to breaking. Because in the dense jungles and fortified caves of the Pacific, the Japanese did not fight to yield. They fought to the death. By late 1942, the Pacific War had entered a new savage phase. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Palaio, names that would become etched in blood and memory. The Japanese Empire, though strained, still fought with unmatched ferocity. They believed surrender was shame, and death was honor. For American forces, this meant that every battle was not just a clash of armies, but a struggle against men who would rather die than yield ground. Japanese infantry excelled at infiltration and close combat. They slipped through jungle trails at night, crawling silently into American lines. They used sudden ambushes, tunnel systems, and banzai charges to overwhelm their enemies in terrifying bursts of violence. To counter this, American commanders needed weapons suited for close-range, instant-stopping power. And so the trench gun was brought to the front lines, not as a sidearm, not as an afterthought, but as a primary weapon for patrols, point men, and those expected to meet the enemy face to face. Shotguns excelled where rifles stumbled. A Garand might miss in the dense brush. A Thompson submachine gun jammed in the mud. But a Winchester trench gun loaded with buckshot could clear an enemy ambush with a single devastating blast. The Japanese soon learned to dread it. Accounts emerged of men charging with bayonets, only to be cut down in an instant, their formations shredded before they closed the distance. Captured diaries tell us how unsettling the shotgun became to Japanese infantry. One officer wrote, "Their shotgun kills like a cannon at close distance. Our men fall in rows, the spirit of the charge breaks when it appears." But for the Marines who carried them, the shotgun wasn't invincible. A Winchester held only 6 shells in the chaos of a banzai charge. When dozens of Japanese soldiers stormed screaming into the lines, every shot had to count. Reloading under pressure was a nightmare. Shells fumbled in the mud, hands shaking, breath short. And yet, slam fire made the weapon something more than just firepower. It became rhythm. Each pump and blast was like a heartbeat in battle. One Marine later described it as playing a drum with death. Still, the war was changing. The Japanese were no longer defending only jungles. They were digging into volcanic rock, coral ridges, and hidden caves. And against those fortresses, even the trench guns struggled. The conflict was escalating, the battles bloodier, and the defenders more desperate. For the men who carried the shotgun, the darkest moments of the Pacific War still lay ahead. Every war story reaches its darkest hour. For the Marines in the Pacific, that moment often came at night. The jungle was not silent after sundown. It breathed, it whispered, it screamed. And when the Japanese attacked under cover of darkness, they came with a fury that seemed unstoppable. Banzai charges were more than tactics. They were a weapon of terror. Entire companies of Japanese infantry would surge forward in wild, desperate assaults. Their goal was not merely to kill, but to break the will of the Americans before them. For the shotgun crews, this was the breaking point. The trench gun could cut swaths through the attackers, but 6 shells disappeared in seconds. Then came the frantic reload, hands fumbling with brass shells slick with sweat and mud. Marines would jam rounds into the magazine as bayonets closed in. Some did not finish in time. Private Sammy Ortega, who once wrote home about carrying a shotgun like on the farm, fell in just such a night attack. His squad reported he fired until the gun clicked empty, then drew his knife. By dawn, he was gone. Even the most fearsome weapon could not guarantee survival. At Peleliu in 1944, the terrain itself became the enemy. Japanese defenders had dug a honeycomb of caves, bunkers, and pillboxes into coral ridges. Rifle fire ricocheted harmlessly from stone. Mortars seemed to vanish into the rock. Shotguns, devastating in the jungle, felt almost useless against an enemy buried deep in the earth. Marines had to crawl to the very mouths of caves, tossing grenades, blasting inside with flamethrowers and shotguns at near point-blank range. Casualties were horrendous. A corporal later recalled, "We had the shotguns, yes. They stopped men cold, but the caves, it was like fighting ghosts. You didn't know if you sound live long enough to pump another round." The trench gun had carried Marines through ambushes, night raids, and jungle charges, but now it seemed to falter. The enemy adapted. The battlefield changed, and the weapon that had once given confidence now seemed fragile against an enemy willing to die 1,000 times over. By 1944 and 1945, the Pacific War was reaching its blood-soaked climax. Japanese soldiers fought with a desperation born of inevitable defeat. Americans, battered and scarred, pushed forward island by island. It was the breaking point for both sides. And in this crucible of fire and fear, a single weapon, even a slam-firing shotgun, could no longer carry the burden alone. Yet, from crisis came a shift. From desperation came a turning point. Every weapon reaches a moment when it must prove its worth, or be left behind. For the Winchester M12, that moment came in the heart of the Pacific. The Japanese had shifted tactics. No longer charging blindly into American guns, they had dug into caves, tunnels, and bunkers carved from volcanic rock. These were not battles of movement. They were sieges. Every ridge, every hill, every cave mouth had to be taken by hand. The Garand rifle was too long for the twisting tunnels. The Bayer machine gun too heavy to maneuver. Even grenades often failed to clear defenders. But the trench gun, short, brutal, and slam-firing, proved perfectly suited for one of the most harrowing tasks of the war, cave clearing. Shells of buckshot tore through the interiors of caves where Japanese defenders lay in wait. Slam fired in rapid succession, the shotgun filled the confined spaces with a storm no man could withstand. It became standard practice: grenades, then flame, then shotgun. A grim trinity of close-quarters destruction. The weapon that once held the line against banzai charges now led the assault into the black mouths of the earth. And here something changed in the hearts of the Marines. No longer was the shotgun only a shield. It was a hammer, an offensive weapon that let them pry the enemy from positions once thought impenetrable. Private diaries tell of the mix of fear and grim determination. One Marine wrote after the Battle of Saipan, "I never knew a man could slam fire 6 shells so fast until I saw Johnson clear that cave. He didn't hesitate, he just pumped and held the trigger, and the echoes came back like thunder rolling in a canyon. When it was quiet, nothing moved inside." The Japanese defenders had expected rifles, bayonets, perhaps even flamethrowers. What they had not expected was the ancient, almost primitive terror of a shotgun unleashed at point-blank range. From this crucible, the tide of war shifted. The Marines had learned to break the enemy's most fortified defenses, and the shotgun was a part of that evolution. The Winchester M12 was never the weapon that won the war. No single weapon did. But in the caves, in the jungles, in the night battles where every heartbeat mattered, it tipped the balance. The turning point was not just tactical, it was psychological. The Marines believed in the shotgun again, and the Japanese knew even their strongest defenses were no longer safe. But victory was never certain. Because with each battle won, the Americans moved closer to islands where the cost would be even higher, where the trench gun would roar louder than ever, and yet still feel drowned in the sea of sacrifice. By 1944, the United States had learned a grim truth. Every island seized from the Japanese would be a fortress, and every fortress would demand new methods of destruction. Strategy in the Pacific was never abstract. It was carried out yard by yard, cave by cave, with sweat and blood. And at the sharp edge of that strategy stood men with weapons suited to brutal, intimate war. The trench gun became part of a methodical pattern. First suppression, machine guns and mortars hammered suspected positions. Second approach, fire teams crawled forward under cover, flamethrower operators and shotgun men moving side by side. Third, assault. Grenades rolled into caves, fire roared in, and then came the shotgun, short, devastating, unerring at close range. It was not elegant, it was not clean, but it was effective. The Winchester M12's slam fire gave it an edge in the chaos. With the trigger held down, each pump became a hammer strike of thunder. In tunnels where seconds decided life or death, that rhythm could mean survival. Marine Sergeant Harold Stone later recalled, "In those caves, you didn't think, you just worked the action, slam fired until the echoes stopped. You didn't see men anymore, just shadows moving. When it was quiet, you reloaded and prayed you make it out." Shotguns also played a role in defense. When Japanese infiltrators slipped into American perimeters at night, the shotgun was the fastest way to end the threat before it spread panic. It was said that in a pitch-black jungle, a Marine with a shotgun could hold a foxhole against an entire squad of attackers. Yet the cost of this strategy was staggering. Every cave taken, every ridge captured, meant Marines exposed to fire, grenades, and booby traps. Thousands of young men were cut down even as the trench gun thundered. And still, the method was repeated. Saipan, Pilaliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Over and over, the grim trinity of grenade, flame, and shotgun cleared the way. The Winchester M12 was not the star of the war, but it was the weapon of the grunt, the man in the mud, the man at the cave mouth, the man who had to face an enemy so close he could smell the sweat on his uniform. It was strategy written, not in theory, but in human struggle. And in that struggle, the trench gun earned its place. But strategy leads to climax. And at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the war reached its most brutal crescendo, where even the slam-fire shotgun would be swallowed by the scale of the bloodshed. Iwo Jima. 8 square miles of volcanic rock, bristling with bunkers, pillboxes, and tunnels. 21,000 Japanese defenders waited, sworn to fight to the death. For 36 days in early 1945, it became a vision of hell. The Marines who landed there faced not open battle but a labyrinth of hidden gun emplacements. Every ridge, every cave concealed men ready to fight until their last breath. In this crucible, the Winchester M12 trench gun became more than a weapon. It was an extension of will. Marines stormed caves with flamethrowers roaring, grenades exploding, and then shotgun blasts echoing like cannon fire in the confined spaces. One Marine later wrote in his diary, "I fired into that hole until my hands were numb. When it was over, I couldn't tell where the smoke ended and the dust began. All I knew was that nothing came out alive." But no matter how many caves were cleared, there were always more. For every yard gained, lives were lost. And then came Okinawa, the largest, bloodiest battle of the Pacific Campaign. More than 180,000 US troops landed, facing a Japanese defense of nearly 100,000. The island became a slaughterhouse. Torrential rain turned hills into mud rivers. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. The Japanese resisted with everything: tunnels, suicide charges, artillery, even women and children pressed into service. For the Marines, it was the ultimate test. In Okinawa's night battles, the slam-fire shotgun was a lifeline. Entire Japanese squads infiltrated US lines, only to be cut down in seconds by the thunderous rhythm of buckshot blasts. But the cost was unbearable. Over 12,000 Americans were killed. More than 70,000 Japanese defenders were annihilated. Civilians caught in the maelstrom perished by the tens of thousands. The climax of the Pacific War was not victory, it was devastation. And yet, amid the chaos, the trench gun had fulfilled its role. It was not the weapon of glory. It was not the weapon of headlines. It was the weapon of survival, of the man in the foxhole, the man at the cave mouth, the man who lived or died by a heartbeat and a trigger pull. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa, it became clear the Japanese infantry had never truly expected such a weapon, and in their final desperate stands, the slam-fire shotgun helped break their defenses, one cavern, one night assault at a time. But when the guns finally fell silent, and the war's end came into view, the question remained: what was the cost for those who survived? When the guns fell silent in 1945, the Pacific War had claimed millions of lives. Cities lay in ruins, nations were shattered, and the world stepped into a new, uncertain age. For the men who carried the trench gun, survival was victory, but survival was not peace. Private First Class Sammy Ortega never came home. His name, like so many, was carved into a white cross on a faraway island. His mother received his letters, but not her son. Corporal James Red Collins did survive. Years later, in an interview, he admitted the shotgun still haunted him.
"It saved my life, sure.
But I shall never forget the look of what it did to men. Sometimes I can still hear it, that slam-fire rhythm, like thunder in my head. I don't know if I shall ever stop hearing it." For Japanese survivors, the aftermath was no less heavy. Kenji Sato's diary, recovered from the ruins of Guadalcanal, ended mid-sentence. His family never knew his final thoughts. For them, like so many across Japan, the war was a wound that never healed. Weapons like the Winchester M12 were cleaned, stored, or passed on to police and later conflicts. But the memories of their use could not be put away so easily. The Marines remembered the weapon not as a symbol of glory, but of necessity. A tool they had to carry, to use, to rely on in the darkest hours. The aftermath of war is not found in medals or parades. It is found in silence. The silence of men who return home but speak little. The silence of families who mourn names etched in stone. And yet, there is something enduring in their struggle. In the jungles, caves, and beaches of the Pacific, young men with shotguns and rifles and flamethrowers faced impossible odds. They carried not only weapons but the unbearable weight of decisions to fire, to survive, to live another day. The Winchester M12 trench gun was just one tool in that vast and terrible struggle. But it left a mark, not only on the battlefield, but on the souls of the men who carried it, and the enemies who faced its thunder. And when the war ended, the question remained: what legacy would it leave behind? The Winchester M12 trench gun was never meant to be a weapon of glory. It was raw, brutal, and terrifying. In the hands of Marines, it was the answer to the chaos of jungle combat. In the memories of those who faced it, both friend and foe, it was unforgettable. But the legacy of this weapon is not about steel and gunpowder. It is about the men who carried it, ordinary young Americans, thrust into extraordinary battles, who used whatever tools they had to endure. It is about the Japanese soldiers who met them with equal determination, often knowing they would not live to see another sunrise. The slam-fire shotgun, with its terrible rhythm, became a symbol of a larger truth: that in war, survival often depends on desperate innovation. That behind every weapon there is a human heart beating fast, gripped with fear, but still choosing to stand and fight. World War II left scars that time cannot erase, but it also left lessons about resilience, sacrifice, and the cost of forgetting. The trench gun reminds us that even the smallest weapon can change the tide of battle, just as the smallest act of courage can change the tide of history. When we remember these stories, we honor more than strategy and firepower. We honor the lives entwined in them, the young men who carried shotguns through jungles, the families who waited in silence, the enemies who fought with equal conviction. Their voices echo still, across oceans and decades. And if we listen closely, we may learn not just about war, but about ourselves. This was the story of the Winchester M12 trench gun, and the men who carried it through the Pacific. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe for more echoes of history waiting to be heard.